He suffered a heroin addiction that he had to go to rehab for. He's also being accused of being an incel at some point. What do you think makes the most sense here? And we are just speculating.
I think given the brutality of the way these murders were carried out, this is an individual certainly that has obviously some mental health issues, but I think this was more of a signal of dominance or control and revenge.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. The more I think about it, the more Bad Teachergate stands out as a major milestone in Kohberger's unraveling at Washington State University. During last night's live, we realized, in terms of those unanswered text messages, that Kohberger likely felt that he'd lost face, lost his reputation, and basically become an outcast in Pullman. In other words, one of the reasons he may have turned his attention to Moscow in the first place was because he may have felt he had exhausted all options in terms of making friends, in terms of reaching out on his home turf. We know from Nancy Grace that Kohberger's father had especially asked his neighbor to extend the hand of friendship. That's a father asking for the help for a 28-year-old guy. We also know that his father sort of answered a lot of questions when they were pulled over in Indiana. According to Nancy Grace, his father had especially asked his neighbor to extend the hand of friendship, only for his wife to basically say,
"I have a bad feeling about this,"
and basically demand that Kohberger not come around again. This is Nancy Grace.
So while the neighbor was making friends with Kohberger, as Kohberger's father had asked him to do, at one point he was going to invite him over to dinner, and his wife said, "Don't. There's just something about him. I don't know what it is. I don't like it."
Basically, please don't let Kohberger come around again. So we know his neighbors were basically avoiding him. And one of them literally said that when he spoke to Kohberger, Kohberger didn't stop. So didn't stop talking. So he quickly learned to avoid talking to him altogether. Talking a lot, sometimes referred to as over-talking, especially to strangers, is a sign of an extremely isolated and often lonely individual. In the class setting, we know that there was an over-talking incident as well, which turned out so bad Kohberger's listener fled, and she accused him of mansplaining. She actually fled the room. Other kids were fed up with his insensitive and or inappropriate anti-LGBTQ remarks as well. And in the ordinary academic space, so many kids were annoyed with Kohberger's strict marking that it literally led to an intervention, what we refer to on this channel as Bad Teachergate, which is a similarly powerful triggering event as the critical Nutgate incident in the Chris Watts case. Nutgate preceded the Watts family murders by about 5 weeks. We have no way of knowing the time span between Bad Teachergate and November 13th. I did actually reach out to Stinchfield on Instagram, haven't heard back from him, but it was likely to have been within 4 months. Now, in order for the students to realize a pattern of unfair marking and discover collectively that it was bad enough, that he was a bad enough teacher to lodge a protest over, one imagines it might have occurred close to the middle of the first semester. In other words, they get their books, they get their study plans. There is a little bit of studying that goes on. There is a certain amount of lecturing going on, and then they tested on it. And then Kohberger grades them unfairly, and then that's repeated. That pattern had to have occurred 2 or 3 times, perhaps more, in order for the students to feel not happy about that. Does that make sense? So it's unlikely, I think, that it happened right in the beginning of June, July, and more likely that I think it happened in August or September, right? So if one of you students who were there who knew this, know when the whole Bad Teachergate incident happened, please let us know in the comments. But what if Bad Teachergate happened around mid-August, right? Around the time that Kohberger was cited for driving in Moscow without a seatbelt in the middle of the night. Did Bad Teachergate sort of lead him to feel like, you know what, I'm going to leave Pullman. I've got a bad feeling about being here. I'm going to leave Pullman and hang out somewhere else where the people don't know me. also was August 21st, his first visit to the neighborhood of the funhouse as well. Before we get to the rest of this episode, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button if you're enjoying this coverage. And let's get started. So, if he was humiliated by his own classmates, own students, own peers, also by, in a strange way, by his professors, what did they think about him? Also by his neighbors who are sort of avoiding him. Literally everyone he seemed to approach. He may have felt Pullman is kaput as a place to try to make friends, and this led him to seek greener pastures in Moscow. Does that make sense? Now, I think on its own, if he simply went to Moscow and things didn't work out there, you might say no big deal. But if things were preceded by a sort of social death in Pullman, just imagine how devastating it had to feel to go even further afield and get exactly the same result. Not interested.
So, whatever it is that you're offering, we're not into it. Don't care, couldn't care less. Goodbye.
Now imagine this. If bad Teachergate never happened, perhaps Koberger would never have found himself with excess time on his hands, lurking around the funhouse late at night, looking for other companionship beyond Pullman, with nothing better to do. If bad Teachergate never happened, possibly Koberger would not have relapsed either in a purely psychological sense, going back down a dark downward spiral, or perhaps falling back on smack, tar, hell dust, China white, thunder, snow, brown sugar, also known as chasing the dragon, or both. Perhaps he went back down in a psychological spiral and with that fell back into relapse in other ways as well. I do think it's fair to say whatever alleged criminal psychology was brewing, it would not have been percolating in the first place if Koberger had found himself glued to some sort of social substrate, whether it was nice neighbors, nice colleagues, or simply random kids he encountered and developed some sort of bond with. Koberger's dad knew he needed it, knew he needed help. His mother apparently was terrified that he might not be able to adjust, and perhaps he didn't, because he couldn't. So if we tie together the threads of A, bad Teachergate, B, the unanswered Instagrams, and which happened in late October, and C, Koberger's backstory as a lonely, bullied misfit and heroin addict during high school, then we possibly have the vital strands we need to connect a deteriorating incel-like psychology in June to the events in November, where because both communities basically seemed to, or it felt like to him, that they gave him the finger, well, he wanted some kind of payback. You heard the expert at the beginning talking about revenge. Well, what kind of revenge? Well, this kind of revenge. Revenge for being humiliated, not just here and now and throughout the semester, but a kind of almost a lifetime's worth of revenge, a lifetime's worth of humiliation. And so perhaps he wanted some payback, and perhaps his interest in criminology, perhaps binge watching Dharma in late September, would have allowed those feelings to really marinate, and all this ultimately put him on a conveyor belt that took him down a dark path of least resistance. So the number 8 clue we all missed was appreciating just how crucially important bad Teachergate was as a milestone, as a psychological milestone that sort of paved the way for everything that followed. It was something that made Brian feel humiliated in a setting that was supposed to edify him. He was supposed to feel good studying to be a PhD. Instead, he felt undermined and thus emasculated on his home campus. We know that he did an about turn after that as well. It's not as though it was water off a duck's back. He did an about turn, switching to high grades universally and kind of losing interest in self-care, personal grooming, and also losing interest in interacting with his students. And in terms of his grading, not really interacting much in that respect either. Now, having said all that, I think think about this deafening silence that has started to surround this case in one particular area. Do you know what I'm talking about? Now, compare that to the following. Think about all the folks we have heard about, all the folks that have broken their silence, besides the victim's parents, besides the victim's friends. Think about Koberger's neighbors upstairs and downstairs. A student of his, Hayden Stinchfield, who told us about bad Teachergate. We heard from him. We heard from a bartender at the nearest bar to his apartment. We heard from a receptionist at a nearby medical center and her boss and his hairdresser. And then on the Moscow side, neighbors to 112 King Road, a taxi driver, the Grub Street manager, a vape store manager, the folks at the corner club. We've seen the body cams showing some of the kids involved at the funhouse, how the noise complaints, plural, were handled. We've gotten to know the corner club and some of the kids at the local fraternities. Who's missing from this picture? We have heard absolutely zip from Koberger's criminology professors. Oh, we've certainly heard from all sorts of other professors in criminology and even his previous professors that all had good things to say about him. But not a single professor at WSU has made a peep about Koberger thus far. And I have to say, in my opinion, I don't think setting Brian up to shoot him down was a great move.
Dick move, Banner.
Obviously, they didn't know about his teetering self-esteem or the fabric of struggle, all of that effortful building himself up from security guard and coming out of that whole high school fat boy, virtual snow and heroin episode, that whole Holocaust, right? They may not have known about that. But even so, was it really the best thing to do? Even if it was a kid with good self-esteem, was that really the way to go about that? But for better or worse, bad Teachergate probably totaled Koberger's already fragile chances at connecting with folks in a slightly trickier culture than he'd known, he'd known and was used to back in Pennsylvania. And Americans who've lived in both states may know what that actually feels like. How is there a bit of a culture shift? How significant is that culture shift? Now, if anyone ought to know what is going on and speak authoritatively about what they saw happening, or should perhaps have seen coming, isn't it his criminology professors? Did they see what is happening? Did they see something coming? Were they aware that something was going on with Brian? Do they bear any responsibility at all? I mean, we are talking about criminology here. Now, even if you say Brian does, he bears all total responsibility, isn't it interesting that literally everyone has spoken up, volunteered information, except Brian's family and the criminology professors at Pullman? I mean, this is their field, isn't it? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.